Hey there, friend. Welcome to another journey through the darker corners of history, where we peel back the comfortable myths and take a long, honest look at what life was really like for our ancestors. I'm genuinely glad you've decided to join me tonight. Whether you're winding down after a long day or finding yourself wide awake in the quiet hours when sleep seems just out of reach. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something oddly comforting about knowing that people from different time zones are all gathered here, exploring the same slice of history together. If this kind of historical storytelling helps you relax or drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you some peace. Now let's set the scene, shall we? Picture this. You're scrolling through social media, complaining about your Wi-Fi being slow, your coffee being lukewarm, or your commute taking an extra 10 minutes. You mutter something about how hard life is, how stressful everything has become, how much easier things must have been back in the day. Well, tonight we're going to take you back to those supposedly simpler times. We're heading to medieval Europe, roughly between the years 1000 and 1400, when life was supposedly more authentic, more meaningful, more connected to the earth and to God. But here's the thing about medieval times that Hollywood and fairy tales conveniently forget to mention. If you were dropped into that world tomorrow, with all your modern sensibilities and expectations, you probably wouldn't survive a single day. Not because you're weak, but because medieval life was so fundamentally brutal, so utterly unforgiving, that even the strongest among us would be crushed by its relentless demands. This isn't going to be a romantic tale of knights and princesses, of noble quests and courtly love. This is the real story, the one they don't put in the history books meant for children. It's the story of what it actually meant to wake up in a world where a toothache could kill you, where saying the wrong thing could get you burned alive, and where the average person's idea of a good year was simply not dying of starvation. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey into a world that was beautiful in its own way, but absolutely nightmarish in ways we can barely comprehend. Let's explore why you wouldn't last a day growing up in medieval times. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1347, somewhere in rural England. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight or the sound, it's the smell. Imagine the worst camping trip you've ever been on. Multiply that by 1,000, then add the lingering aroma of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food, and something you desperately hope isn't a decomposing rat in the corner. Welcome to your new bedroom. You're lying on what passes for a bed, which is essentially a pile of straw covered by a rough woolen blanket that hasn't been washed since your grandfather was born. The straw is alive with fleas, lice, and other tiny creatures that have been feasting on you all night. Your pillow is a sack filled with more straw, possibly some chicken feathers if you're lucky, and it smells like a barn floor because, well, that's essentially what it is. There are no windows in your home. Glass is a luxury reserved for cathedrals and the homes of the extremely wealthy. Instead, there might be a small opening in the wall covered with a piece of oiled cloth or animal skin, which does absolutely nothing to keep out the cold, the rain, or the various insects that call this place home. The walls themselves are made of wattle and daub, essentially sticks woven together and covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, you're living inside walls partially made of excrement, and that's considered normal construction. Your entire family shares this single room with you. And when I say family, I mean everyone. Parents, siblings, grandparents, and quite possibly a few cousins who had nowhere else to go. Privacy is not a concept that exists, neither is personal space. You sleep inches away from people who haven't properly bathed in months, listening to them snore, cough, and make various other bodily sounds throughout the night. But wait, there's more. You also share this space with your animals. Chickens roost in the rafters above your head, occasionally dropping their contributions onto your blanket below. A pig might be snuffling around in the corner, not because you're particularly fond of pigs, but because it represents a significant portion of your family's wealth and cannot be left outside where it might be stolen. If you're relatively prosperous, there might be a goat or even a cow sharing your living quarters. The smell, as you can imagine, is indescribable. The floor beneath your feet is packed dirt, covered with rushes and straw that haven't been changed in weeks. This organic carpet is home to fleas, mice, rotting food scraps, and various unidentifiable liquids. When it rains, which it does frequently in medieval England, the roof leaks and the floor becomes a muddy swamp. When it's dry, every step kicks up dust that makes you cough and wheeze. You try to sit up, and immediately your back screams in protest. That's because you're about 22 years old, which in medieval terms makes you practically middle-aged, and your spine has already been worn down by years of back-breaking labour. Your joints ache constantly from the damp cold that permeates everything, and your hands are cracked and bleeding from work and weather. Speaking of weather, let's talk about staying warm. It's early November, and the temperature inside your home is barely above freezing. There's a fire pit in the centre of the room, but fuel is precious and scarce. Wood must be gathered from forests that may or may not legally belong to you. Get caught taking deadfall from the wrong nobleman's land, and you could lose a hand. The fire fills the room with smoke because there's no proper chimney, just a hole in the roof that doesn't work very well. Your eyes water constantly, your throat burns, and everyone in your family has a persistent cough that they'll carry until spring, if they're lucky enough to live that long. Your clothing consists of a single woolen tunic that you've worn every day for the past 6 months. It's never been properly washed because soap is expensive and hard to come by. Instead, it gets an occasional rinse in cold water, which does nothing to remove the accumulated sweat, dirt, and various stains. The wool is coarse and scratchy against your skin, and it's held together with patches upon patches because new clothes are luxuries you simply cannot afford. Underneath, if you're fortunate, you might have a linen undergarment, but more likely, you're wearing nothing beneath the tunic except your own increasingly unwashed skin. Your shoes, if you have them, are simple leather wrappings that provide minimal protection against the cold and wet. Most days, you go barefoot, your feet hard and calloused, picking up splinters, cuts, and infections that you simply have to endure because medical care doesn't exist for people like you. But let's talk about the most pressing issue of your morning. You need to relieve yourself. In our modern world, this means a quick trip to a private bathroom with running water, toilet paper, and proper sanitation. In medieval times, it means venturing outside to a communal pit that serves the entire village, assuming you're lucky enough to have one. More likely, it means finding a spot behind the house and hoping none of the neighbours are watching. There's no toilet paper, of course. If you're particularly well off, you might use a handful of straw or some soft leaves. More often, you make do with a stick, a stone, or simply your hand, which you'll later rinse in cold water if water is available. The waste doesn't disappear magically into a sewer system. It sits there, attracting flies and spreading disease, contributing to the overwhelming stench that characterizes medieval life. Hygiene, as we understand it, simply doesn't exist. The concept of germs won't be discovered for another few hundred years, so nobody understands why people get sick or how disease spreads. Water is often contaminated, so paradoxically, the safest thing to drink is weak ale or watered-down wine, which means everyone, including children, is slightly intoxicated most of the time. Bathing is considered not just unnecessary but potentially dangerous. Many people believed that water opened your pores and let evil humours into your body. Your teeth, assuming you still have any, are rotting in your head. Dental care consists of pulling out teeth when they become too painful to bear, usually with a pair of pliers and no anaesthesia. Sugar is rare, but the constant diet of coarse bread and fermented beverages still wreaks havoc on your mouth. Most people your age have already lost several teeth, and your breath could probably kill small animals. As you stumble around your cramped, smelly, freezing home, trying to wake up properly, you realize that this isn't just a bad morning. This is every morning. This is your life. And we haven't even gotten to the fun parts yet, like trying to find food, avoiding disease, dealing with the local nobility who own you and everything you'll ever possess, or navigating the complex religious and social rules that govern every aspect of your existence. In our modern world, waking up is often the easiest part of the day. You roll out of a comfortable bed, stumble to a private bathroom with hot running water, brush your teeth with fluoride toothpaste, take a hot shower, put on clean clothes that you've selected from a closet full of options, and grab breakfast from a refrigerator stocked with food from around the world. The entire morning routine takes maybe an hour, and you're ready to face the day feeling clean, fed, and reasonably comfortable. In medieval times, waking up is when the real struggle begins. You're cold, you're dirty, you're hungry, you're surrounded by the sights and sounds and smells of extreme poverty, and you know that the day ahead will be filled with back-breaking labor just to survive until tomorrow. And this is assuming you're one of the lucky ones. You're not a slave. You're not in the middle of a war. You haven't been accused of witchcraft, and you don't have the plague. Your stomach growls, reminding you that you haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon, and that meal consisted of a piece of dark bread and some thin gruel. Breakfast, if it exists at all, will be more of the same. But first, you need to get dressed, which in medieval times is less about selecting an outfit and more about putting on the same filthy, patched, uncomfortable clothes you wear every single day. The morning light, what little of it filters through your cloth-covered window opening, reveals the full horror of your living situation. The walls are stained with smoke, moisture, and things you'd rather not identify. The ceiling is black with soot, and you can see daylight through several gaps in the thatching above. Your few possessions, a wooden bowl, a spoon, perhaps a knife, are scattered around the room, covered in dust and grime. This is your reality now. This is how billions of people lived for hundreds of years. And remember, this is just the beginning of an ordinary day in medieval times. We haven't even left the house yet. Now that you've managed to put on your single set of clothes and stumble toward what passes for your front door, it's time to face the outside world. And if you thought your living conditions were challenging, wait until you see what medieval streets have to offer. Step outside your hovel, and you're immediately ankle-deep in what can only be described as a medieval cocktail of horrors. The streets aren't paved with cobblestones like in the movies. Those are reserved for the very wealthiest parts of major cities. Instead, you're walking on packed earth that has been transformed into a muddy soup of human waste, animal droppings, rotting food scraps, and various liquids that you really don't want to identify. Medieval people had a charming custom of simply throwing their waste out the window into the street below. Chamber pots were emptied with a cheerful cry of "Gardez-l'eau," a corruption of the French "Gardez à l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." Except it wasn't water. It was everything that had come out of human bodies during the night, and it landed with a splat right where you're now trying to walk. The animals wandering freely through the streets contributed their own generous portions to this aromatic mixture. Pigs, chickens, goats, and the occasional cow roamed the village, relieving themselves wherever they pleased. Dead animals, cats, dogs, rats, and birds were simply left to rot where they fell, adding their own special perfume to the medieval street experience. But the real challenge isn't just the mess under your feet. It's the fact that this toxic soup is your water supply. The same streams and wells that provide drinking water are contaminated by all this waste flowing downhill. That's why everyone drinks ale instead of water. Not because they're all alcoholics, but because the fermentation process kills some of the bacteria that would otherwise kill them. As you navigate this obstacle course of filth, trying to find relatively solid ground for each step, you start to notice your neighbours emerging from their own hovels. And here's where you get your first real glimpse of what medieval life has done to the human body. Everyone looks older than they actually are. A woman who appears to be in her 60s is probably only 35. A man who seems ancient and bent with age might be younger than you. Medieval life ages people the way a hard winter ages trees, rapidly, harshly, and visibly. The children you see are small for their ages, with the telltale signs of malnutrition, thin limbs, distended bellies, and a listless quality that comes from never having quite enough to eat. Many are missing fingers or have visible scars from accidents that would be minor inconveniences today, but were life-threatening injuries in medieval times. A simple cut could become infected and kill you, so everyone you see is either very lucky or very scarred. The adults bear the marks of their daily labor. The blacksmith's arms are covered in burn scars. The carpenter is missing 2 fingers from his left hand. The miller has a persistent cough from breathing grain dust all day, every day, for years. The women's hands are cracked and bleeding from constant washing in cold water and lye soap that's harsh enough to strip skin. Everyone, absolutely everyone, is infested with parasites. Fleas hop visibly on clothing. Lice crawl through hair and beards. People scratch constantly, unconsciously, the way you might fidget with a pen. It's just part of life, like breathing or blinking. The idea of being parasite-free is as foreign to them as the idea of flying to the moon. Their teeth, when visible, tell stories of pain and neglect. Black stumps, missing molars, abscesses that have swollen entire sides of faces. Dental pain is a constant companion for most adults, a dull ache that never quite goes away and occasionally flares into agony that can only be ended by having the tooth pulled with crude tools and no anesthesia. But perhaps most striking is how everyone moves. There's a careful, measured quality to their steps, the way people move when they know their bodies are fragile and replaceable parts don't exist. A sprained ankle could mean starvation if you can't work. A broken bone might never heal properly, leaving you permanently disabled in a world where disability means death. The smell of unwashed humanity mingles with the street filth to create an olfactory assault that would make a modern person vomit instantly. But these people don't notice anymore. Their noses have been overwhelmed into submission by the constant barrage of offensive odors. What would send you running for the nearest shower barely registers to them. As you stand there, taking in this medieval street scene, you realize that you haven't even had breakfast yet, and already the day has presented you with challenges that would defeat most modern people. The simple act of walking to the village well for water, assuming the well isn't contaminated, which it probably is, requires navigating a minefield of human and animal waste, while trying not to cut your feet on the broken pottery, animal bones, and metal scraps that litter the ground. And this is a normal day. This is what passes for ordinary life in medieval times. There's no plague outbreak happening right now, no war being fought in the streets, no witch trials underway. This is just Tuesday morning in the 14th century, and already you're confronted with living conditions that would be considered a humanitarian crisis by modern standards. But wait, you hear a commotion from the direction of the village square, voices raised in excitement or perhaps fear. In medieval times, any unusual activity could mean anything from a traveling merchant with news from distant lands to an announcement that the local lord has decided to raise taxes again, or worse, that he needs more young men for his latest military adventure. You make your way through the muddy streets, dodging the worst of the filth and trying not to breathe too deeply through your nose. Other villagers are converging on the square, their faces showing the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension that you feel. Because in medieval times, news was rarely good news for common people like you. As you get closer, you can see a small crowd gathered around a man on horseback, clearly someone of importance, judging by the fact that he's mounted and his clothes, while still rough by modern standards, are cleaner and less patched than those of everyone else. This might be a bailiff, a representative of the local lord. or perhaps even a traveling merchant with goods to sell and stories to tell. But first, before you can find out what's happening, your stomach reminds you again that you haven't eaten anything since yesterday afternoon. In our modern world, going without breakfast might make you a little grumpy and less focused. In medieval times, missing meals is a serious matter that could affect your ability to work. And if you can't work, you don't eat tomorrow either. So you reluctantly turn away from the gathering crowd and head toward your family's small plot of land, where today's survival depends on whatever tasks await you. Because in medieval times, curiosity is a luxury you can't afford, when hunger is a constant companion, and every day begins with the same fundamental question. Will there be enough food to keep you alive until tomorrow? The sun is now fully up, casting long shadows across the village, and you realize that you've been awake for less than an hour. Already you've been assaulted by sights, smells, and experiences that would traumatize a modern person. And the real work of the day hasn't even begun yet. In our comfortable modern lives, we often romanticize the past, imagining simpler times when people lived closer to the land and closer to each other. But the reality is that medieval life was a daily struggle against conditions so harsh that survival itself was an achievement. Every person you see on these medieval streets is a survivor, someone who has beaten odds that would defeat most of us without breaking a sweat. And as you prepare to face whatever challenges the rest of this medieval day will bring, you're beginning to understand why historians don't spend much time talking about the daily lives of ordinary people in medieval times. It's not because their lives weren't important, it's because their lives were so relentlessly difficult that even describing them honestly makes the past sound like a horror story. But this horror story was reality for millions of people for hundreds of years. This was how most of humanity lived for most of human history. And we're just getting started. Now that you've made it to your family's small plot of land, it's time to confront one of the most fundamental challenges of medieval life: finding enough food to survive another day. And when I say food, I don't mean the abundant variety we take for granted today. I'm talking about whatever meager sustenance you can scratch from the earth, assuming the weather cooperates, the crops don't fail, and the local lord doesn't decide he needs most of your harvest for himself. Your breakfast, if you're lucky enough to have one, consists of a chunk of dark, coarse bread that's so hard you need to soak it in weak ale just to make it chewable. This bread isn't made from refined wheat flour like the soft loaves you're used to. Instead, it's a dense, gritty mixture of whatever grains were available: barley, rye, oats, and sometimes ground acorns or even sawdust when times are particularly hard. The texture is somewhere between cardboard and gravel, and it tastes about as appetizing as it sounds. If you're having an especially good day, you might have a bowl of pottage to go with your bread. Pottage is essentially medieval gruel, a thin soup made from whatever vegetables haven't rotted yet, mixed with grain and water, and cooked over the fire until it reaches the consistency of wallpaper paste. It's not seasoned with anything because spices are worth more than gold to people like you. Salt, the most basic of seasonings, is so valuable that it's sometimes used as currency. But here's the thing about medieval farming that would absolutely destroy most modern people. You don't own the land you're working. You're what's called a serf, which is essentially a step above slavery. The land belongs to your lord, and you belong to the land. You can't leave. You can't sell your labor to someone else, and you can't make decisions about what to plant or when to harvest. You're farming someone else's land with someone else's tools, and when harvest time comes, the Lord gets the first and largest share. Your farming tools are nothing like the efficient equipment modern farmers use. Your plow is a simple wooden stick with a metal tip, if you're lucky enough to have metal at all. More likely, it's just a sharpened piece of wood that you drag behind an ox, assuming your family is wealthy enough to own an ox. If not, you're pulling the plow yourself, which explains why your back feels like it's been broken and reset incorrectly every morning. The work is backbreaking in ways that our mechanized world can barely comprehend. Every seed is planted by hand. Every weed is pulled by hand. Every stalk of grain is cut by hand with a sickle that's probably older than you are. Harvest time means working from dawn until dark, bent over in the fields, cutting grain and binding it into sheaves, while racing against weather that could destroy months of work in a single afternoon. And speaking of weather, you have no reliable way to predict it. There's no weather forecast, no meteorology, no understanding of atmospheric pressure or seasonal patterns. You plant when the local priest tells you to plant, based on the church calendar, and you pray that God doesn't decide to send too much rain, too little rain, an early frost, or a late spring. One bad weather year means famine, and famine means watching your children slowly starve while you make impossible decisions about who gets the last handful of grain. But let's say you've managed to scratch together enough food for breakfast, and you're ready to start the day's work. As you head toward the fields, you notice something that would be completely foreign to modern experience: the total absence of privacy or personal space. Everyone knows everyone else's business because everyone lives on top of each other. There are no secrets in a medieval village because there's nowhere to keep them. Your neighbor calls out to you from across the muddy lane, and you can immediately tell from his voice that something's wrong. His youngest child, a little girl of maybe 4 years old, has been coughing up blood for the past 3 days. In our world, this would mean an immediate trip to the doctor, antibiotics, maybe a hospital stay, and a full recovery. In medieval times, it means the family is preparing for a funeral. There's no medical care available for people like you. No doctors, no hospitals, no understanding of germs or infection, or even the most basic principles of hygiene. When people get sick, they pray. They might try some folk remedies passed down through generations, and mostly they die. Child mortality is so high that parents often don't name their babies until they're several months old, because there's no point getting attached to something that probably won't survive. The average life expectancy is somewhere around 30 years, but that number is misleading because it includes all the babies who die in their first year. If you make it to adulthood, you might live to see 40 or even 50, but you'll spend those years watching your body break down from the constant physical labor and poor nutrition. Your hands will be permanently gnarled from arthritis, your back will be permanently bent from bending over crops, and your face will be weathered and aged far beyond your actual years. As you work in the fields, the sun beating down on your back through your single layer of rough clothing, you start to understand something that modern people never have to think about: how precarious your existence really is. You're always one accident, one illness, one bad harvest, one arbitrary decision by your Lord away from disaster. There's no safety net, no insurance, no savings account, no government assistance. If you can't work, you don't eat. If you don't eat, you die. It's that simple. The social hierarchy is rigid and absolute. You were born a serf, you'll die a serf, and your children will be serfs after you. There's no social mobility, no opportunity for advancement, no way to improve your circumstances through hard work or intelligence or luck. Your Lord owns you the same way he owns his horses or his hunting dogs, and he has about as much concern for your welfare. Speaking of your Lord, you catch a glimpse of him riding through the village on his way to hunt in the forest that you're forbidden to enter. He's mounted on a horse that's worth more than your family will earn in 10 lifetimes, wearing clothes that represent more wealth than your entire village will see in a year. He doesn't acknowledge your existence as he rides past, because to him, you're not really a person. You're a resource, like wheat or timber, useful for what you can produce, but not worthy of individual consideration. The contrast between his life and yours is so stark, it's almost incomprehensible. While you're wearing the same unwashed tunic you've worn for months, he changes clothes daily. While you're drinking contaminated water and weak ale, he's enjoying wine imported from distant lands. While you're sleeping on straw infested with parasites, he's resting in a bed with actual sheets and pillows. But here's what's really crushing about medieval social hierarchy. It's not just about wealth. It's about the absolute certainty that this is how things are supposed to be. The church teaches that God has ordained this system. that your poverty and suffering are part of his divine plan, and that questioning the social order is not just rebellion against your earthly lord, but rebellion against God himself. You're taught from birth that your role is to work, to suffer, to serve, and to be grateful for the opportunity to do so. The idea that you might deserve better, that you might have rights or dreams or aspirations beyond mere survival, is not just discouraged, it's literally unthinkable. The very words and concepts don't exist in your vocabulary. As the morning wears on and your back begins to ache from bending over the crops, you realize that this isn't just a hard day's work. This is your entire life stretching out ahead of you. Tomorrow will be exactly like today, and next year will be exactly like this year, and the year after that, and the year after that, until your body finally gives out and you die in the same hovel where you were born. There's no weekend to look forward to, no vacation, no retirement, no leisure time at all. When you're not working in the fields, you're working around the house, mending tools, preparing food, caring for animals, spinning thread, weaving cloth. Every waking moment is devoted to the basic tasks of survival, and even then, survival is never guaranteed. The sun is getting higher now, and you can feel the heat beginning to build. In our air-conditioned world, hot weather means adjusting the thermostat or maybe switching to lighter clothes. In medieval times, it means working in heavy wool clothing that traps sweat and heat, with no relief except whatever shade you can find during the brief moments when you're allowed to rest. You wipe the sweat from your forehead with a hand that's already caked with dirt and plant matter, and you realize that you've been awake for maybe 3 hours. In that time, you've been assaulted by sights, smells, and experiences that would traumatize most modern people, and you haven't even encountered any of the really serious challenges yet. No plague outbreak, no war, no famine, no accusations of witchcraft or heresy. This is just an ordinary morning in medieval times. And already it's clear that the romanticized version of the past that we see in movies and books bears no resemblance to the brutal reality of daily life in the 14th century. The idea that these were simpler, more authentic times starts to seem not just wrong, but almost insulting to the millions of people who suffered through these conditions, with no choice and no hope of anything better. But your stomach is growling again, reminding you that the small piece of bread you managed to choke down at dawn is already burning through the hard physical labor, and the next meal is still hours away. In our world of abundant food and regular meals, hunger is usually just a minor inconvenience. In medieval times, it's a constant companion, a gnawing reminder that you're always just one missed meal away from weakness, one missed day of work away from starvation. And hunger, as you're about to discover, is just the beginning of your daily medieval nightmare, because now it's time to deal with what happens when your body inevitably breaks down from the constant strain, poor nutrition, and complete absence of medical care. Let's say you're working in the fields, swinging that primitive sickle through the grain, when you feel a sharp pain shoot through your lower back. In our modern world, this might mean a trip to the doctor, some anti-inflammatory medication, maybe a few days of rest, and you're back to normal. In medieval times, it means you've just acquired a permanent disability that will plague you for the rest of your shortened life. There are no doctors for people like you. The few physicians who exist serve only the nobility, and their understanding of medicine is so fundamentally wrong that you're probably better off without them anyway. Medieval medical theory is based on the concept of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the belief that illness comes from these being out of balance. The cure for almost everything is bloodletting, which involves cutting open your veins and letting you bleed until you're weak and pale, on the theory that this will restore harmony to your bodily fluids. If you're lucky enough to encounter a medieval physician, he might diagnose your back pain as an excess of hot, dry humours and prescribe having leeches attached to your spine to suck out the bad blood. Or he might recommend trepanation, drilling a hole in your skull to let the evil spirits escape. These aren't primitive folk remedies. This is the cutting-edge medical science of the 14th century. More likely, though, you'll never see a physician at all. Instead, You'll rely on the local wise woman, who might have some genuine knowledge of herbal remedies passed down through generations, but who's also just as likely to prescribe wearing a dead mouse around your neck or drinking a potion made from ground-up unicorn horn. And even if she does know some effective treatments, she has to be incredibly careful about how she practices, because any woman with too much knowledge about healing is automatically suspect of witchcraft. So your back pain becomes chronic, getting worse every day as you continue the back-breaking labor that's causing it, because stopping work isn't an option. You develop a permanent stoop, your movements become slower and more careful, and you age 10 years in the space of a few months. Your productivity drops, which means less food for your family, which means malnutrition, which makes you more susceptible to every disease that sweeps through the village. And diseases sweep through medieval villages like wildfire through dry grass. Without any understanding of germs or contagion, people have no idea how to prevent the spread of illness. They don't wash their hands because they don't understand the connection between cleanliness and health. They drink contaminated water because they don't know it's contaminated. They live in close quarters with their animals and their waste because they don't realize this creates breeding grounds for disease. The result is a constant parade of illnesses that would be easily preventable or treatable today, but are death sentences in medieval times. Dysentery turns your intestines into a source of agony and dehydration. Tuberculosis slowly drowns you in your own blood. Smallpox covers your body with oozing sores. The sweating sickness strikes without warning, killing healthy adults in a matter of hours. And through it all, you have no pain relief except whatever alcohol you can get your hands on, assuming you can afford it. But let's say you manage to avoid serious illness for now. You're still dealing with the constant, grinding reality of medieval dental care, which is to say, no dental care at all. Your teeth are rotting in your head from a diet of coarse bread and fermented beverages, and there's nothing you can do about it except endure the pain until it becomes unbearable. When a tooth finally becomes so infected that you can't sleep or eat, your only option is to have it pulled. Not by a dentist, they don't exist, but by the local blacksmith or barber, who will use a pair of iron pliers to grip the tooth and yank it out of your head while you're fully conscious and screaming. There's no anesthesia, except maybe a gulp of strong alcohol if you're lucky. The extraction is performed without any understanding of sterile technique, so infection is almost guaranteed. Many people die from tooth abscesses that spread infection to their brains. Others lose so many teeth that they can barely eat solid food, which accelerates their decline into malnutrition and death. By the time you're 30, if you live that long, you'll probably be missing half your teeth, and the ones that remain will be brown, loose, and painful. Your breath, needless to say, could kill small animals. But this isn't considered unusual or particularly unpleasant, because everyone's breath smells like a combination of rotting meat and sewage. The concept of oral hygiene simply doesn't exist. Some people might chew on aromatic herbs to freshen their breath slightly, but this is purely cosmetic and does nothing to address the underlying dental decay. As you work through the morning, trying to ignore the various pains in your back, your joints, your stomach, and your mouth, you notice that the sky is beginning to cloud over. In our modern world, this might mean checking the weather app on your phone and maybe grabbing an umbrella. In medieval times, it could mean the difference between eating this winter and starving. Weather is the enemy of medieval agriculture in ways that modern farming, with its irrigation systems and crop insurance and global food distribution networks, has largely overcome. Too much rain and your crops rot in the fields. Too little rain and they wither and die. A late frost can destroy months of work in a single night. A hailstorm can flatten an entire harvest in minutes, and you have no way to predict or prepare for any of it. Weather forecasting won't be invented for another few hundred years. You plant your crops based on the church calendar and the phases of the moon, and you pray that God doesn't decide to send a natural disaster your way. When the weather turns bad, all you can do is watch helplessly as your family's survival for the coming year literally disappears before your eyes. The psychological toll of this uncertainty is something that modern people, with our weather satellites and emergency services and disaster relief, can barely comprehend. Imagine living every day knowing that forces completely beyond your control could destroy everything you've worked for, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except pray and hope that you're not the unlucky one this time. But even if the weather cooperates, you're still not safe, because now we need to talk about the social and political realities of medieval life that could destroy you just as easily as any natural disaster. You live in a world where saying the wrong thing, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or simply attracting the wrong kind of attention could result in your death, and there's no legal system that will protect you. Your Lord has absolute power over your life and death. He can have you beaten, imprisoned, or executed for any reason or no reason at all. He owns you, your family, your labor, and everything you will ever produce. If he decides he doesn't like the way you looked at him, or if someone tells him you said something disrespectful, or if he simply needs to make an example of someone to keep the other serfs in line, you could find yourself hanging from a tree by sunset. There are no rights, no due process, no appeals. Justice is whatever the Lord says it is, administered however he chooses to administer it. The Church supports this system by teaching that earthly lords derive their authority directly from God, so resisting your Lord is tantamount to resisting divine will. You're trapped in a system designed to keep you powerless, voiceless, and completely dependent on the whims of people who see you as less than human. And even if your particular Lord happens to be relatively benevolent, that could change at any moment. Lords die, inheritances are disputed, lands change hands through marriage or conquest. A new Lord might have completely different ideas about how to manage his property, and you are part of that property. He might decide that your village is taking up space that could be better used for sheep pasture, in which case you and everyone you've ever known could be evicted from the only home you've ever had, with nowhere to go and no way to survive. The legal system, such as it exists, is stacked against people like you in every possible way. If you're accused of a crime, you don't get a lawyer or a jury of your peers. Instead, you might face trial by ordeal, where your guilt or innocence is determined by your ability to survive being thrown into a river, grabbing a red-hot iron bar with your bare hands, or being tortured until you confess. The theory is that God will protect the innocent and punish the guilty, but in practice, it's just a way to legitimize whatever outcome the authorities want. As you continue working in the fields, the clouds overhead getting darker and more threatening, you start to hear voices from the direction of the village. Not the normal sounds of daily life, but something more urgent, more frightened. In medieval times, unusual activity usually means bad news for someone, and that someone is almost always people like you. You straighten up from your work, ignoring the shooting pain in your lower back, and strain to hear what's happening. The voices are getting closer, and now you can make out individual words. Tax collector, soldiers, assessment. Your blood runs cold because you know what this means. The Lord has decided he needs more money, probably to fund another war, or to pay tribute to a more powerful noble, and that means extracting it from the people who can least afford it, you and your fellow serfs. A tax assessment in medieval times isn't like filing your income taxes today. There's no standardized system, no appeals process, no concept of what constitutes a fair share. The tax collector simply decides how much your village needs to pay, and if you can't pay it, you lose your home, your possessions, and quite possibly your life. The soldiers accompanying the tax collector aren't there to fill out paperwork. They're there to enforce collection through whatever means necessary. If you can't pay in money, you might pay in livestock, in grain, in tools, or in family members who can be sold into slavery to cover the debt. If you resist, you'll be beaten or killed as an example to others. This is the reality of medieval taxation. It's not a civic duty or a contribution to the common good. It's extortion backed by the threat of violence. The money collected won't be used to build roads or schools or hospitals for your benefit. It will go toward maintaining the lifestyle of people who already have more wealth than they could spend in a lifetime, while you and your children go hungry. But even as you're processing this new threat to your survival, you realize that the dark clouds overhead have begun to release their first fat raindrops. In our climate-controlled world, rain might be a minor inconvenience that makes you reach for an umbrella or postpone your outdoor plans. In medieval times, it could be the beginning of the end for everything you've worked toward. If this turns into a heavy downpour, it could flatten the grain that you've spent months nurturing. If it continues for days, it could rot your crops in the fields, leaving you with nothing to harvest and nothing to eat through the coming winter. And if it's followed by an early frost, which often happens when the weather patterns are disrupted, it could destroy not just this year's crop, but next year's planting as well. You have no insurance against crop failure, no government assistance programs, no way to buy food from distant markets if your local harvest fails. When the crops fail in medieval times, people starve. Not metaphorically, not temporarily, but literally and permanently. They eat grass and bark and anything else they can find. They watch their children grow thin and weak, and they die in numbers that would constitute a humanitarian crisis by modern standards. The rain is falling harder now, and you can see other workers in nearby fields looking up at the sky with the same expression of helpless dread that you're feeling. This is what medieval life really means, being completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control, with no safety net and no hope of rescue. As you stand there in the field, rain soaking through your single layer of rough clothing, tax collectors approaching your village, your back aching from the constant labor, your teeth throbbing with pain, your stomach cramping from hunger, you begin to understand something that our comfortable modern lives shield us from. Just how precarious human existence really is when stripped of all the technological and social advances we take for granted. Every single aspect of your life, your health, your food supply, your shelter, your safety, your family's survival, depends on factors that you cannot predict, cannot control, and cannot escape. You wake up each morning not knowing if this will be the day that disease, weather, violence, or simple bad luck finally overwhelms your ability to cope. And yet somehow, millions of people lived this way for hundreds of years. They endured conditions that would break most modern people within days. And they did it without complaint, because complaining was not just useless, it was dangerous. They found ways to create meaning and even moments of joy within lives that were brutally hard by any measure. But as you stand there in the rain, watching the tax collectors' horses splash through the muddy village streets, you can't help but think that anyone who romanticizes these times as somehow more authentic or meaningful than our modern lives has never actually tried to live them. The rain is falling steadily now, and you can hear the squelch of boots approaching through the mud. The tax collector has arrived, flanked by two soldiers, whose chainmail gleams dully in the grey light. In our modern world, a visit from government officials might mean paperwork and bureaucracy, but at least you'd have rights, legal protections, and a system designed to treat you as a human being with inherent dignity. In medieval times, you're about to discover what it means to be considered property. The tax collector is a thin man with cold eyes and ink-stained fingers, riding a horse that's worth more than your entire village will earn this year. He doesn't dismount. That would require acknowledging that you and your neighbors are worthy of basic courtesy. Instead, he remains seated high above you, literally and figuratively, looking down on the people whose labor funds his comfortable lifestyle. By order of his lordship, he announces in a voice that carries the authority of someone who's never worried about where his next meal will come from. This village owes 40 silver marks in additional tribute to be paid immediately. The sum is astronomical, more money than your village has seen in the past 5 years combined. You watch as your neighbors' faces drain of color, the same sickening realization hitting everyone at once. This is impossible. But impossibility, you're learning, is not an acceptable excuse in medieval times. When the tax collector says immediately, he means it. The soldiers' hands rest casually on their sword hilts, and their message is clear: pay now or face the consequences. There will be no payment plans, no appeals to higher authority, no consideration of your circumstances or ability to pay. Your village elder, a man whose bent back and gnarled hands testify to decades of back-breaking labor, steps forward with the careful movements of someone who knows that a single wrong word could result in a beating. "My lord," he says, his voice carefully respectful, "we have had poor harvests this season. The rains came late, and many of our crops—" "I don't care about your crops," the tax collector interrupts. "I care about collecting what is owed. If you cannot pay in silver, you will pay in kind. Livestock, grain, tools, whatever has value. What follows is a medieval nightmare that would be considered theft by any modern standard." The soldiers begin moving through the village, taking inventory of anything that might have monetary worth. That pig you've been sharing your living space with, the one that represents months of careful feeding and your family's insurance against starvation. Gone. The tools your father used and his father before him, the ones you've spent years maintaining and sharpening because replacements are impossible to afford. Confiscated. The grain you've been saving for winter, the thin barrier between your family and famine, loaded onto carts to disappear into your lord's granaries. The chickens that provide your only reliable source of protein, driven away by soldiers who show no more emotion than if they were collecting firewood. But here's what makes this scene particularly horrifying from a modern perspective. It's completely legal. There are no property rights for people like you, no protections against seizure, no concept that you might have earned or deserved to keep the fruits of your labor. Everything you have, everything you are, belongs to your Lord by divine right, and he can take it whenever he chooses for whatever reason he deems appropriate. As you watch your neighbors weep silently, tears being the only form of protest they dare express, you realize that this isn't even considered an injustice by medieval standards. This is simply how the system works. The strong take from the weak, the powerful exploit the powerless. And God apparently approves because he has ordained this social order. Your own family loses nearly everything. The cow that provided milk for your children is led away by a soldier who doesn't even look at their faces as they cry. The iron plow tip that took your grandfather years to save for, the tool that means the difference between productive farming and scratching uselessly at the earth with sticks, disappears into a sack with dozens of other collected items. When the tax collectors finally leave, their carts loaded with your village's survival, you're left standing in the rain with your neighbors, looking at what remains of your lives. Most families have lost 60 or 70% of their possessions. Some have lost everything except the clothes on their backs and the hovels they sleep in. And even those could be taken if the Lord decides he needs the land for something more profitable. The psychological impact of this kind of systematic theft is something that our modern minds, protected by concepts of individual rights and legal protections, can barely process. Imagine working 16-hour days for months, carefully saving and planning and building toward a better future for your children, only to have it all taken away in an afternoon by people who already have more than they could ever need. But there's no time to process the trauma, no counseling services or support groups, no social safety net to help you recover. Tomorrow, you'll still need to find food for your family, and now you'll have to do it with even fewer resources than before. The rain is still falling, threatening what's left of your crops, and winter is coming whether you're prepared for it or not. As you trudge back toward your hovel, your feet squelching through mud that's now mixed with the tears and desperation of your entire community, you pass by the village church. In our secular modern world, you might turn to government services, charitable organizations, or legal aid in times of crisis. In medieval times, the church is theoretically your source of comfort and assistance, but the reality is far more complex and often deeply disappointing. The priest who serves your village is not the kindly, compassionate figure you might expect from modern depictions of medieval clergy. He's a political appointee, chosen not for his spiritual wisdom or dedication to helping the poor, but for his loyalty to the same Lord who just robbed you blind. His comfortable stone house, with its glass windows and tiled roof, stands in stark contrast to the mud and thatch hovels where his parishioners struggle to survive. When you approach him, hoping for some words of comfort or perhaps practical assistance for your newly destitute neighbours, his response is both predictable and crushing. This tribulation is a test of your faith, he tells you, his well-fed face showing no trace of genuine sympathy. Accept your suffering with humility, for God rewards those who endure hardship without complaint. This isn't just empty platitude. It's the official theological position of the medieval church. Your poverty, your suffering, your children's hunger are all part of God's plan. The wealthy are wealthy because God has blessed them for their virtue. The poor are poor because they deserve to be, either through their own moral failings or as punishment for ancestral sins. Questioning this system isn't just socially dangerous. It's heretical. The Church's role in maintaining medieval oppression cannot be overstated. While modern religious institutions often advocate for social justice and care for the poor, the medieval Church was an integral part of the system that kept people like you powerless and desperate. They taught that earthly suffering was spiritually beneficial, that accepting injustice was morally superior to fighting it, and that your reward for a lifetime of exploitation would come in the afterlife, assuming you were sufficiently grateful for your oppression. But even as you're grappling with the spiritual and psychological aftermath of being systematically robbed, your body is reminding you of more immediate concerns. You haven't eaten anything substantial since yesterday, and the physical demands of medieval life don't pause for financial catastrophe. Your stomach is cramping with hunger, your hands are shaking from low blood sugar, and you're beginning to experience the lightheadedness that comes from prolonged malnutrition. In our modern world, even people experiencing food insecurity have access to food banks, government assistance programs, and emergency services. Medieval society offers no such support systems. When you're hungry, you either find food or you go without. When you go without long enough, you die. It's that simple and that brutal. The irony is that you're surrounded by food that you cannot access. The Lord's forests are full of game that you're forbidden to hunt. His streams contain fish that you're not allowed to catch. His orchards bear fruit that would be considered theft if you took even a single apple. The very land you work produces abundance, but almost none of it belongs to you. Poaching, hunting, or gathering food from lands that technically belong to your Lord is punishable by death, and the punishment is enforced with enthusiastic brutality. The Lord's foresters patrol their territory with trained dogs and sharp eyes, looking for any sign that someone has dared to take what belongs to their master. Getting caught with so much as a rabbit in your possession could result in your hands being cut off, or worse. As you make your way home through the mud and rain, you see evidence of this system everywhere. Dead rabbits hang from tree branches, not as food, but as warnings, the remains of animals killed by spring traps set by the Lord's gamekeepers. These traps are designed not just to catch animals, but to maim or kill any human desperate enough to try stealing them. The message is clear. The Lord would rather see food rot than allow hungry peasants to eat it. Your hovel, when you finally reach it, feels even smaller and more miserable than it did this morning. The tax collectors took your only decent pot, your sharp knife, and even the wooden bowls your family used for meals. You're left with crude implements carved from wood, utensils so primitive they would be considered unusable by modern standards. But you still need to prepare some kind of meal for your family, using what little remains after the day's catastrophe. You've managed to hide a small amount of grain by burying it under the floor of your hovel. A common peasant strategy for protecting resources from both tax collectors and bandits. It's not much, maybe enough for thin porridge that will leave everyone still hungry, but it's better than nothing. The process of making this meager meal illustrates another aspect of medieval life that would defeat most modern people: the sheer amount of time and physical effort required for the most basic tasks. You need to start a fire, which means gathering dry tinder in the rain, coaxing sparks from flint and steel, and carefully nursing the flames while trying not to use too much of your precious fuel supply. Then you need to grind the grain by hand, using stones that are heavy and awkward to maneuver. This isn't the quick work of a modern food processor. It's long, tedious labor that leaves your arms aching and your hands raw. Each grain must be crushed individually, and the process produces a coarse, gritty meal that bears little resemblance to the refined flour we're accustomed to. The cooking itself is done over an open fire that fills your single room with smoke, making your eyes water and your throat burn. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that doesn't work very well, so the smoke has nowhere to go except through your lungs. Everyone in your family has a persistent cough that never quite goes away, and the interior walls of your hovel are black with soot. As your family gathers around the fire to share this pathetic meal, you're struck by how different this scene is from our modern concept of family dinner time. There's no conversation about how everyone's day went, no discussion of plans for tomorrow, no warm family bonding. Instead, there's the grim silence of people focused entirely on the mechanical act of consuming enough calories to survive another day. Your children, ages ranging from 5 to 15, show the unmistakable signs of chronic malnutrition. They're small for their ages, their growth stunted by years of inadequate food. Their hair is thin and brittle, their teeth are already showing signs of decay, and they have the listless, apathetic demeanor that comes from bodies that are slowly consuming themselves to stay alive. The youngest, a little girl who should be bright and energetic, sits quietly in the corner, too tired to play or even speak much. In our world, this would trigger immediate medical intervention and social services involvement. In medieval times, it's so normal that nobody even comments on it. Children who survive to adulthood in this environment are the lucky ones, the strong survivors of a brutal selection process that claims roughly half of all babies before their first birthday. Your wife, aged far beyond her 28 years by constant childbearing and backbreaking labor, moves slowly around the fire, her face showing the blank expression of someone who has learned not to hope for anything better. She's been pregnant 7 times and has buried 3 children, each loss a devastating blow that she's had to endure without any of the psychological support or medical understanding that we take for granted. The silence in your hovel is broken only by the sound of rain dripping through the leaky roof and the occasional cough from lungs damaged by constant smoke exposure. This is your family time, your moment of rest and connection, and it's characterized by exhaustion, hunger, and the kind of grinding poverty that makes every day a struggle for survival. But even this meager shelter and pathetic meal represent a kind of privilege in medieval society. You have a roof over your head, however leaky it might be. You have family members who are still alive and relatively healthy. You have enough food to keep everyone breathing for another day. Millions of people in medieval Europe had less than this, and many had nothing at all. The truly destitute, widows without family support, orphaned children, disabled people who couldn't work, elderly people whose children had died, existed in conditions that would shock even hardened social workers today. They begged in the streets, slept in doorways or under bridges, and died of exposure, starvation, and disease in numbers that medieval society simply accepted as normal and inevitable. There were no homeless shelters, no disability benefits, no foster care systems, no social safety nets of any kind. When people fell through the cracks of medieval society, they simply disappeared, their deaths unrecorded and unmourned, except by whatever family members might still remember them. As you sit by your smoky fire, listening to the rain and trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in your belly, you begin to understand something that our comfortable modern lives shield us from. Just how thin the line is between survival and catastrophe, between having just enough and having nothing at all. Tomorrow you'll wake up and face the same challenges all over again, but now with even fewer resources than you had this morning. The tax collectors will return eventually, because they always do, and next time you'll have even less to give them. The rain will either stop, allowing your remaining crops to survive, or it will continue until everything rots in the fields and your family faces starvation this winter. These aren't distant theoretical possibilities. They're immediate, pressing realities that will determine whether you and your loved ones live or die in the coming months. And there's absolutely nothing you can do to influence the outcome except work harder, pray more fervently, and hope that luck, weather, and the arbitrary whims of your social superiors will somehow align in your favor. This is what medieval life really means, existing in a state of constant vulnerability, where forces beyond your control can destroy everything you've worked for in a matter of hours, and where your children's survival depends not on your love or dedication or hard work, but on factors as random as the weather and as cruel as the tax collector's mood. As the fire burns lower and your family prepares for another night of fitful sleep on beds of straw, you realize that you've now been awake in this medieval world for nearly 12 hours. In that time, you've experienced more genuine hardship, fear, and desperation than most modern people encounter in years of comfortable living. And this was just an ordinary day in the 14th century. No plague outbreak, no war, no witch trials, no natural disasters beyond a bit of rain. Just the normal, everyday reality of life in medieval times, which was brutal enough to break most people without any additional catastrophes. The scary part isn't that people live this way. It's that they lived this way for hundreds of years, generation after generation, with no realistic hope that things would ever get better. This wasn't a temporary crisis or an unusual hardship. This was simply how most of humanity existed for most of human history. And we're not even halfway through a single medieval day yet. The flickering light from your dying fire casts dancing shadows on the soot-stained walls as you settle down for what passes as sleep in medieval times. But before you can even close your eyes, you're reminded that the night brings its own special collection of medieval horrors that would make our modern concept of insomnia seem like a luxury vacation. First, there's the cold. The fire that barely heated your single room during the day has now burned down to glowing embers, and the November chill seeps through every crack in your mud and dung walls, like icy fingers searching for warmth to steal. Your single woolen blanket, stiff with accumulated grime and crawling with parasites, provides about as much insulation as a dish rag. In our centrally heated homes, we might throw on an extra blanket or adjust the thermostat. In medieval times, you have two choices: burn more fuel that you can't afford, or lie there shivering until dawn. Most nights, you choose to shiver, because using up your winter fuel supply in November means freezing to death in February. But the cold is just the beginning of your nighttime ordeal. Your straw mattress, which seemed uncomfortable this morning, has now compressed into something resembling a thin layer of twigs spread over hard-packed earth. Every position you try puts pressure on your aching joints and work-worn muscles. Your back, already strained from a day of medieval farming, finds no relief on this primitive excuse for bedding. The sounds of the night would drive any modern person to madness. Your neighbours, separated from you by walls so thin they might as well be suggestions, cough and wheeze and mutter in their sleep. Babies cry with the particular desperation of children who are always slightly hungry. Adults moan in their sleep, their bodies processing the day's accumulation of pain and exhaustion. The animals sharing your living space contribute their own symphony of disturbing noises. The pig snorts and shuffles in the corner, occasionally squealing for reasons you can't determine and don't want to investigate. Chickens rustle and cluck in the rafters above your head, sometimes releasing droppings that land uncomfortably close to your face. Mice scurry through the walls with the bold confidence of creatures who know they outnumber you and aren't particularly afraid of your ability to catch them. But perhaps most disturbing are the sounds from outside your hovel. Medieval nights are not the peaceful, quiet affairs we might imagine. Dogs bark constantly, not the happy barking of well-fed pets, but the aggressive, territorial snarling of half-wild creatures fighting over scraps of food and warm places to sleep. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear what might be human voices raised in anger or fear or pain. It's impossible to tell which, and you know better than to investigate. The Night Watch, such as it exists, consists of a few armed men whose job is to protect the Lord's property, not to keep common people safe. If you hear screams in the darkness, your best strategy is to pull your blanket over your head and pray that whatever's happening doesn't spread to your part of the village. Getting involved in other people's troubles is a luxury you can't afford when your own survival is constantly in question. Sleep, when it finally comes, is not the peaceful restoration we expect in our comfortable modern beds. It's a fitful, interrupted doze punctuated by the need to scratch flea bites, adjust your position to avoid the worst lumps in your mattress, or deal with the various bodily functions that don't pause just because you're trying to rest. Medieval people don't sleep through the night the way we do. Instead, they experience what historians call segmented sleep, falling asleep shortly after dark, waking up for several hours in the middle of the night, then sleeping again until dawn. This isn't a lifestyle choice. It's a biological adaptation to living conditions that make continuous sleep nearly impossible. During those wakeful, midnight hours, you lie in the darkness, listening to your family breathe and wondering if everyone will still be alive in the morning. Disease can strike without warning in medieval times, and people often die in their sleep from illnesses that would be easily treatable today. Your youngest child's cough has been getting worse, and you know that what starts as a simple cold can quickly become pneumonia, which is essentially a death sentence in the 14th century. But let's say you do manage to fall into a deeper sleep, despite the cold and the discomfort and the various noises. Even then, your rest is haunted by the medieval version of anxiety dreams. You dream about tax collectors returning to take what little you have left. You dream about your crops failing and your family starving. You dream about being accused of some crime you didn't commit and facing the brutal medieval justice system with no one to defend you. These aren't the abstract nightmares of modern life, where we might dream about being late for work or failing an exam. These are survival nightmares based on very real possibilities that could destroy your life tomorrow. In a world where death is always just one accident, one illness, one bad harvest, or one false accusation away, your sleeping mind has plenty of genuine terrors to process. When you do wake up, which happens frequently throughout the night, you're confronted with the medieval bathroom situation all over again. There's no indoor plumbing, no private toilet, no toilet paper. In the middle of a cold, rainy November night, answering nature's call means either using a chamber pot that will make your already smelly hovel even more unbearable, or venturing outside into the mud and darkness to find a suitable spot. The chamber pot option means living with the smell until morning, when you can empty it into the street with everyone else's waste. The outdoor option means stumbling through the dark, hoping you don't step on something sharp or fall into a ditch while trying to accomplish your business in freezing rain with no light and no privacy. Either way, you're reminded once again that basic human dignity is a luxury that medieval life doesn't provide. Every biological function becomes an ordeal. Every basic need becomes a challenge that requires planning and endurance. The simple act of relieving yourself, which takes 30 seconds in our modern bathrooms, becomes a significant event that can determine how miserable the rest of your night will be. As you lie there in the darkness, listening to your family's breathing and trying to ignore the various discomforts that make sleep nearly impossible, you start to understand something that our comfortable modern lives have allowed us to forget. How much of human existence used to be devoted simply to surviving the night? We take for granted that we'll wake up in the morning warm, rested, and ready to face the day. Medieval people went to sleep each night, knowing that dawn was not guaranteed, that the cold or the hunger or the disease that had been manageable during the day might become overwhelming in the vulnerable hours of darkness. The psychological toll of this constant uncertainty is something that our modern minds, protected by medical science and social safety nets, can barely comprehend. Imagine lying down each night knowing that you, or someone you love, might not survive until morning. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except hope and pray. But even prayer, in medieval times, carries its own burden of fear and complexity. The Christianity of the 14th century is not the gentle, forgiving religion that many modern people imagine. It's a harsh, demanding faith that emphasizes sin, punishment, and the constant possibility of eternal damnation. As you whisper your nighttime prayers, you're not just asking for protection and blessing, you're confessing your sins and begging forgiveness for transgressions you might not even be aware of committing. The medieval church teaches that virtually everything enjoyable is potentially sinful. Eating too much, sleeping too much, enjoying your spouse's company too much, feeling proud of your work, complaining about your hardships, all of these natural human responses to life are considered evidence of moral failing that could damn your soul forever. So even your prayers become another source of anxiety. Are you praying correctly? Are you showing sufficient humility? Are you being adequately grateful for your suffering, which the church teaches is spiritually beneficial? Have you committed sins today that you've forgotten to confess? The very act of seeking comfort from religion becomes another opportunity for self-doubt and fear. As the hours drag by and you drift in and out of uncomfortable sleep, you become aware of a new sound outside your hovel, the rhythmic clanking of metal on stone. It takes you a moment to identify it, but when you do, your blood runs cold. Those are the footsteps of armed men, and they're moving through your village with purpose. In our modern world, the sound of people walking past your house at night might be mildly annoying, but it wouldn't be particularly alarming. We have police, streetlights, emergency services, and a general expectation that we're safe in our own homes. In medieval times, armed men moving through your village at night usually means someone is about to have a very bad experience, and there's a decent chance that someone might be you. The possibilities are all terrifying. It could be soldiers from a neighbouring lord conducting a raid to steal livestock and grain. It could be your own lord's men conducting a nighttime search for evidence of poaching, tax evasion, or other crimes against the feudal order. It could be bandits who have decided that your poor village might still have something worth stealing. Or it could be church officials searching for evidence of heresy or witchcraft. You lie perfectly still, trying to control your breathing, hoping that the armed men will pass by your hovel without deciding to investigate. Your family is awake now too. You can tell by the change in their breathing patterns, but nobody moves or speaks. In medieval times, you learn early that drawing attention to yourself when dangerous people are nearby is often a fatal mistake. The footsteps pause outside your door, and you hear voices speaking in low, urgent tones. You can't make out the words, but the tone is businesslike and cold. The way people sound when they're discussing unpleasant tasks that need to be completed efficiently. Your heart is pounding so loudly, you're afraid they might hear it through the thin walls. After what feels like hours, but is probably only minutes, the footsteps move on, and the voices fade into the distance. You and your family continue to lie still, waiting to see if they'll return, listening for sounds that might indicate what their purpose was. Eventually, you hear a commotion from the other end of the village. Shouts, the sound of a door being broken down, a woman screaming. Someone has been arrested, or worse. In the morning, you'll learn that it was the widow Marga, accused of cursing her neighbour's cow after an argument over property boundaries. The cow died 2 days later, which in medieval logic is proof enough of witchcraft. She'll be tortured until she confesses, then burned alive in the village square as a warning to others who might be tempted to practice dark arts. The fact that Marga is a devoutly religious woman, who has never shown any interest in anything more supernatural than herbal remedies for common ailments, is irrelevant. The fact that the cow probably died from the same disease that has been killing livestock throughout the region doesn't matter. Someone needed to be blamed for the misfortune, and Marga, as a woman living alone without male protection, made a convenient target. This is the reality of medieval justice. It's not about truth or evidence or protecting the innocent. It's about maintaining social control through fear, demonstrating the power of the authorities, and providing simple explanations for complex problems. When bad things happen, someone must be punished, and that someone is usually whoever is most vulnerable and least able to defend themselves. As you lie there in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of Marga's arrest, and knowing that you'll probably watch her burn tomorrow, you're confronted with another aspect of medieval life that would destroy most modern people: the complete absence of justice, fairness, or protection for ordinary citizens. In our world, we have legal systems designed to protect the innocent, police forces trained to investigate crimes properly, and courts that at least attempt to determine guilt or innocence based on evidence. We have concepts like due process, presumption of innocence, and the right to legal representation. None of these protections exist in medieval times. If you're accused of a crime, you're probably guilty in the eyes of the law, regardless of the actual facts. If you're poor, friendless, or different in any way, you're an easy target for accusations whenever something goes wrong. If you're a woman, especially one without a husband or male relatives to protect you, you're particularly vulnerable to charges of witchcraft, adultery, or other offences that carry death sentences. The arbitrariness of medieval justice means that you could live your entire life as a law-abiding, devout, hard-working person and still end up being tortured and executed because someone needed a scapegoat for their problems. There's no appeal process, no higher court to review your case, no investigation to determine what really happened. Once you're accused, your fate is essentially sealed. This knowledge colours every interaction you have with your neighbours and community members. You can't afford to have enemies, because an enemy might accuse you of crimes you didn't commit. You can't afford to be too successful or too different, because success and difference attract suspicion. You can't afford to argue with anyone or stand up for yourself, because conflict might escalate into accusations that could destroy your life. The psychological pressure of living under this kind of arbitrary authority is something that people in democratic societies can barely imagine. Every word you speak, every action you take, every relationship you form must be carefully calculated to minimize the risk of attracting the wrong kind of attention from people who have the power to destroy you. As the sounds from Marga's arrest finally fade into silence, you realize that the rest of your night will be spent lying awake, wondering if you've done anything recently that could be interpreted as suspicious or threatening. Did you complain too loudly about the tax collection? Did you fail to show sufficient respect to the priest last Sunday? Did someone see you gathering herbs in the forest and decide that you might be practicing folk magic? These aren't paranoid fantasies. They're realistic assessments of the dangers that medieval people faced every day. In a world where accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or sedition could be based on nothing more than gossip, grudges, or coincidence, everyone was potentially one bad day away from finding themselves on the wrong end of medieval justice. The irony is that this constant fear was considered a feature, not a bug, of the medieval system. The authorities wanted people to be afraid because fear kept them obedient and compliant. A population that lived in constant terror of arbitrary punishment was much easier to control than one that felt secure in their rights and freedoms. But for you, lying in your cold, uncomfortable bed, listening to your family's anxious breathing and wondering if you'll all still be alive tomorrow, this system represents a level of oppression and brutality that makes every day a struggle, not just for physical survival, but for psychological endurance. The night drags on, bringing with it a parade of medieval miseries that would be unthinkable in our modern world. The temperature continues to drop, turning your breath visible in the smoky air of your hovel. The rain that threatened your crops during the day has turned into a steady downpour that finds every gap in your thatched roof, creating new puddles on your dirt floor that will freeze by morning. Your youngest child, the little girl who has been coughing for days, starts making a wheezing sound that you recognize with growing dread. In our world, this would mean a trip to the emergency room, antibiotics, maybe a nebulizer treatment, and a full recovery. In medieval times, it means you're probably about to lose another child to the respiratory infections that kill medieval children with horrifying regularity. There's nothing you can do except hold her close, sharing what little warmth your body can provide, and listen to her struggle for breath. No medicine exists that could help her. No doctor would come to treat a peasant child even if you could afford to pay one. The local wise woman might have some herbal remedies, but they're more likely to be based on superstition than actual medical knowledge. You find yourself making the kinds of desperate bargains with God that parents have made throughout history. Take me instead. Let her live, and I'll accept any hardship. I'll be more grateful for what we have. But even as you pray, you know that the medieval God is not known for his mercy toward the poor. The Church teaches that suffering is spiritually beneficial, that earthly hardship is a sign of divine favor, that accepting pain without complaint is the path to salvation. The child's breathing becomes more labored as the night progresses, and you realize that you're probably witnessing the beginning of the end. In a few days, maybe a week, you'll be digging another small grave in the churchyard, adding another tiny marker to the collection of stones that represent the children who didn't survive their medieval childhoods. This isn't unusual or unexpected. It's simply the normal reality of medieval family life. Parents expect to lose children, plan for it, develop emotional defenses against it. The idea that childhood should be a time of safety, health, and carefree play is a modern luxury that medieval families couldn't afford to indulge. As you hold your sick child and listen to her labored breathing, you're struck by how different the experience of parenthood is in medieval times compared to our modern world. Today, we expect our children to survive, thrive, and have opportunities to build better lives than we had. We invest enormous emotional energy in their development, their education, their happiness. Medieval parents love their children just as deeply, but they can't afford to invest too much hope in any individual child's future. The mortality rates are too high, the dangers too numerous, the opportunities too limited. Instead, they focus on teaching survival skills, obedience to authority, and acceptance of whatever fate God chooses to impose. The dawn, when it finally comes, brings no relief from the night's anxieties. Instead, it reveals the full extent of the damage that the previous day's rain has done to your remaining crops. What little grain survived the tax collector's seizure is now flattened and beginning to rot in the fields. The vegetables you were counting on to supplement your family's meager diet through the winter have been turned into a soggy, inedible mess. In our modern world, crop failure might mean higher food prices or insurance claims. In medieval times, it means starvation. Not metaphorical hunger, not temporary hardship, but literal starvation. The slow, agonizing process of watching your body consume itself while you become too weak to work, too weak to think clearly, too weak to care for your family. You've now been awake in this medieval world for 24 hours, and you've experienced more genuine hardship, fear, and desperation than most modern people encounter in years of comfortable living. You've been robbed by tax collectors, threatened by armed men, terrorized by arbitrary justice, and confronted with the reality that your child might die from an illness that would be easily curable today. And this was just an ordinary day in the 14th century. No plague outbreak, no war, no witch trials, no natural disasters beyond a bit of rain. Just the normal, everyday reality of life in medieval times, which was brutal enough to break most people without any additional catastrophes. The truly terrifying part isn't that people live this way. It's that they lived this way for hundreds of years, generation after generation, with no realistic hope that things would ever get better. This wasn't a temporary crisis or an unusual hardship. This was simply how most of humanity existed for most of human history. And as you prepare to face another day of medieval survival, you're beginning to understand that the romantic vision of the past that we see in movies and fairy tales is not just inaccurate. It's an insult to the millions of people who suffered through these conditions with no choice and no hope of escape. The morning light reveals a world transformed by the night's rain and cold. The village streets, already treacherous with mud and waste, have become nearly impassable rivers of freezing slush. The thatched roofs of your neighbours' hovels sag under the weight of accumulated water, and you can see that at least 2 houses have partially collapsed during the night, their inhabitants now homeless in the November cold. But there's no time to help your neighbours, or even to fully assess the damage to your own property, because survival in medieval times means that every moment of daylight must be devoted to the endless task of finding enough food and fuel to make it through another night. Your sick child is worse this morning, her breathing shallow and rapid, her small body burning with fever. In our world, this would trigger an immediate response: emergency rooms, pediatric specialists, advanced life support. In medieval times, it means you carry her with you as you go about your daily tasks, because leaving her alone could mean returning to find her dead, and working is not optional even when your child is dying. This is the reality that no romantic vision of medieval times ever captures: the grinding, relentless nature of a life where there are no breaks, no time off, no possibility of rest, even in the face of personal tragedy. The crops don't stop needing attention because your child is sick. The animals don't stop needing care because you're grieving. The law doesn't stop demanding tribute because your family is falling apart. You wrap your feverish daughter in your only spare piece of cloth and head out into the cold morning, knowing that today will bring new challenges that will test your ability to survive in a world that was never designed for human comfort or happiness. The medieval day is just beginning, and already you understand why most modern people wouldn't last even this long, in a time when every sunrise brought fresh horrors and every sunset was a small victory against overwhelming odds. The sun climbs higher in the grey November sky, and you realize that you've survived your first full day and night in medieval times. But survival, as you're learning, is not the same as living. It's simply the act of continuing to breathe, to move, to endure, while everything around you conspires to make that continuation as difficult and miserable as possible. And there are still centuries of this ahead, generations of people who will be born into this system, live their entire lives within its constraints, and die without ever knowing that human existence could be any different. The medieval world is not just a historical period. It's a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, and a reminder of how far we've come from those dark and desperate times. But for now, as you hold your sick child and prepare to face another day of medieval challenges, you can only focus on the immediate task of surviving the next few hours. Because in medieval times, that's all anyone can do. Take life one breath at a time, one step at a time, one small victory at a time, and hope that somehow, against all odds, tomorrow will be just slightly less terrible than today. Your wife approaches through the morning mist, her face showing the same haunted expression that you've seen on every adult in the village. She's carrying news from the other families, and from the way she moves, carefully, as if the words themselves might shatter something fragile, you know it's not good news. The miller's boy didn't wake up this morning, she whispers, her voice barely audible above the sound of dripping water from the damaged roofs. And old Henrik is asking for the priest. In our modern world, death announcements come with grief counselling, funeral homes, and support systems. In medieval times, death is such a constant companion that news of it is delivered in the same tone you might use to mention that the weather looks threatening. Not because people don't feel the loss, but because feeling it too deeply is a luxury that can destroy your ability to keep your own family alive. The miller's boy was 8 years old, healthy just 3 days ago, dead from what we would recognize as a simple case of pneumonia that turned septic. Henrik is maybe 45, ancient by medieval standards, and his family is already making arrangements for his funeral, because when people start asking for the priest in medieval times, they usually don't recover. These deaths aren't unusual events that shake the community. They're ordinary Tuesday morning occurrences that everyone acknowledges with a brief nod before moving on to the more pressing business of not joining the deceased. The psychological adaptation required to function in this environment would be considered pathological by modern standards, but it's essential for medieval survival. Your wife's news gets worse. The baker says there's no grain left for bread today. Maybe tomorrow, if the grain merchants come from the next village. Maybe not. Hey, this isn't inconvenient. It's potentially catastrophic. The coarse, dark bread that forms the foundation of every medieval meal isn't available, which means your family's already inadequate nutrition just became even more precarious. In our world, if one store doesn't have what we need, we drive to another one. If local supplies run short, global distribution networks ensure that food arrives from thousands of miles away. Medieval people live in isolated pockets where a local shortage means genuine hunger, and a regional shortage means death. But there's no time to process this information or plan alternative strategies, because your sick child has taken a turn for the worse. Her breathing has become so labored that each inhalation sounds like a desperate gasp, and her fever has spiked to the point where her small body is burning to the touch. In our medical system, this would trigger emergency interventions. In medieval times, it means you're probably watching your daughter die. The local wise woman, when she finally arrives, takes one look at the child and shakes her head with the resignation of someone who has seen this scenario play out hundreds of times. Her bag of remedies contains herbs that might provide some comfort, but nothing that could actually address the underlying infection that's destroying your child's lungs. Keep her warm, she advises, which is impossible in a hovel that's barely above freezing. Give her water when she can take it, she adds, though the only water available is from the contaminated village well. And pray, she concludes, because in medieval times, divine intervention is the only real medical option for serious illness. The wise woman's fee for this consultation is a precious egg from your remaining chickens. Payment that you can't afford but can't refuse, because even useless medical advice is better than no medical advice at all. She leaves with your egg and your last shred of hope, and you're left holding a child who might not survive the day. But medieval life doesn't pause for personal tragedy. Even as you're watching your daughter struggle for breath, there are urgent tasks that cannot be delayed. The animals still need feeding, though your feed supplies are running dangerously low. The remaining crops still need harvesting, though most of them are now damaged beyond use. The Lord's demands still need meeting, though you have less to give him than ever before. Your wife takes over the care of your sick child, freeing you to venture out into the village for the grim task of finding food for the rest of your family. What you discover is a community on the edge of complete collapse, held together only by the shared understanding that falling apart is not an option when survival depends on mutual cooperation. The village well, your primary source of water, has become contaminated with runoff from the night's rain. The water that comes up in the bucket is brown, foul-smelling, and obviously unsafe even by medieval standards. But it's the only water available, so people are boiling it and hoping that heat will kill whatever diseases might be lurking in the murky liquid. The communal ovens where bread is normally baked stand cold and empty, their fires extinguished because there's no grain to bake. The village blacksmith has stopped working because families can no longer afford to pay for tool repairs. The carpenter, who might have helped repair damaged roofs, has been conscripted by the Lord for work on his castle, leaving the villagers to struggle with makeshift repairs, using whatever materials they can scavenge. This cascade of small failures illustrates something that modern people, protected by redundant systems and global supply chains, rarely experience: how quickly a functioning community can deteriorate when multiple essential services fail simultaneously. In our world, if one system breaks down, others compensate. In medieval times, communities exist so close to the edge of viability that any disruption can trigger a spiral toward complete collapse. The social fabric that holds medieval communities together is surprisingly fragile, based more on necessity than genuine affection or shared values. People cooperate because they have to, not because they want to, and when resources become scarce, that cooperation can evaporate with terrifying speed. You witness this breakdown firsthand when you encounter two neighbors arguing over a pile of firewood. In better times, they might have shared resources or worked out a compromise. Today, with winter approaching and fuel supplies critically low, the argument quickly escalates to the point where one man threatens the other with an axe. The dispute is resolved not through negotiation or community mediation, but by the intervention of the Lord's bailiff, who confiscates the firewood for his master's use and threatens both men with imprisonment if they disturb the peace again. This is medieval conflict resolution: arbitrary authority imposed through the threat of violence, with ordinary people losing regardless of who was right or wrong. As you make your way through the village, searching desperately for any available food or fuel, you begin to understand how medieval communities could disintegrate so quickly during times of crisis. The bonds that hold people together are based primarily on mutual dependence, and when that dependence becomes impossible to maintain, society reverts to a brutal competition for survival where former neighbors become potential threats. The psychological toll of living in this environment is evident in the faces of everyone you encounter. There's a hollow, desperate quality in their eyes, the look of people who have been pushed beyond their normal capacity for endurance. Children cling to their parents with the instinctive knowledge that the adult world has become even more dangerous than usual. Adults move with the careful, measured steps of people who know that any mistake could be their last. But perhaps most disturbing is the way that people have begun to avoid eye contact with each other, as if acknowledging their neighbor's suffering would make their own situation even more unbearable. The community that existed just a few days ago, with its networks of mutual support and shared responsibility, is fragmenting into isolated family units focused entirely on their own survival. This social disintegration is not a failure of character or morality. It's a rational response to conditions that make broader community cooperation impossible. When resources are so scarce that helping others means condemning your own family to death, altruism becomes a luxury that few can afford. Your search for food leads you to the village's most desperate residents: the elderly, the disabled, and the widowed women who have no male relatives to protect them. These are the people who are always the first to suffer when resources become scarce, and their condition today illustrates just how quickly medieval society can abandon its most vulnerable members. Old Margaret, who has lived in the village for 70 years and raised 6 children, is now reduced to begging for scraps because her sons died in various wars and accidents, leaving her with no one to provide for her. In our world, she would have social security, Medicare, and social services. In medieval times, she has nothing except whatever charity her neighbors can spare, and charity is in very short supply today. The widow Catherine, whose husband died in a farming accident last spring, is facing eviction from her hovel because she can't pay the rent without a man's income. Her 2 young children will likely be separated and sent to work for different families, because keeping them together is an economic impossibility that no one can afford to support. These aren't unusual cases or temporary hardships. They represent the normal fate of people who lose their place in the medieval economic system. There's no safety net, no government assistance, no charitable organizations with the resources to provide meaningful help. When medieval people fall through the cracks, they simply disappear, and their disappearance is accepted as a natural and inevitable part of life. The callousness required to function in this environment would be considered sociopathic by modern standards, but it's actually a necessary survival mechanism. Medieval people learn early that they cannot save everyone, cannot help everyone, cannot even acknowledge everyone's suffering without becoming paralyzed by the enormity of the misery around them. As you continue your desperate search for food, you encounter a scene that illustrates the medieval approach to social problems. A group of village men forcibly expelling a family of beggars who had sought shelter in an abandoned building. The beggars, a man with a missing leg and his pregnant wife, are driven out into the cold rain with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The men doing the expelling aren't cruel or heartless. They're terrified. They know that allowing desperate strangers to settle in their village would mean sharing resources that are already inadequate for the existing population. They also know that beggars attract the attention of authorities, who might decide that the village has too many idle mouths to feed and needs to be reorganized in ways that could destroy everyone's precarious existence. This scene encapsulates the impossible moral choices that medieval life forces on ordinary people. Do you help strangers and risk your own family's survival? Do you protect your community by excluding others, knowing that you might be condemning them to death? Do you follow your conscience or your survival instincts when the two are in direct conflict? Modern people, protected by social safety nets and legal systems that at least attempt to balance competing interests, rarely face choices this stark. We have the luxury of moral complexity, of trying to help others without destroying ourselves, of believing that there might be solutions that don't require someone to suffer. Medieval people don't have these luxuries, and the psychological cost of making life and death decisions on a regular basis is evident in the faces of the men who just expelled the beggars. They know they may have just murdered 2 people and an unborn child, but they also know that letting them stay might have meant watching their own children starve. The pregnant beggar woman's eyes meet yours for just a moment as she's forced to leave, and in that glance, you see a plea for help that you cannot answer. You have nothing to give her, no resources to share, no influence to intervene on her behalf. You can only watch as she and her husband disappear into the grey morning, knowing that you'll probably never see them alive again. This moment of powerlessness in the face of obvious injustice is one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of medieval life. Modern people expect to be able to help when they encounter suffering, to call authorities or charitable organizations, to do something meaningful to address problems. Medieval people learn to witness terrible things and walk away, because intervention is often impossible and always dangerous. As you finally give up your search for food and turn back toward your hovel, empty-handed and increasingly desperate, you realize that your daughter's condition has become the least of your family's problems. Even if she recovers from her illness, the broader collapse of your village's support systems means that survival through the coming winter has become unlikely for everyone. The rain continues to fall, washing away the last of your damaged crops and turning the village streets into impassable rivers of mud and waste. The temperature is dropping steadily, promising a freeze that will kill any remaining vegetation and make outdoor work impossible. Your family's food supplies, already inadequate, will have to last much longer than originally planned. But perhaps most ominously, you can see smoke rising from the direction of the Lord's castle, suggesting that he's preparing for some kind of major activity, possibly another military campaign that will require additional taxes and conscripted soldiers from villages that are already barely surviving. In our modern world, we would respond to this kind of crisis by mobilizing emergency resources, coordinating relief efforts, and implementing systems to prevent similar disasters in the future. Medieval people can only hunker down, try to endure whatever comes next, and hope that enough of them survive to rebuild when the crisis passes. The sun reaches its zenith in the grey sky, marking the halfway point of your second day in medieval times. In that brief span, you've witnessed the collapse of community support systems, the abandonment of moral principles in favour of survival, and the systematic exclusion of the most vulnerable people from any hope of assistance. You've learned that medieval life is not just physically brutal, but psychologically devastating in ways that would break most modern people within days. The constant moral compromises, the endless witnessing of suffering you cannot address, the daily choices between your family's survival and your human decency. These challenges would destroy anyone who hadn't been conditioned from birth to accept them as normal. But the most terrifying realization is that this crisis isn't unusual or temporary. This is simply what happens in medieval times when normal problems compound into larger disasters. The systems that keep medieval communities functioning are so fragile that any disruption, bad weather, disease, economic demands from the nobility can trigger a cascade of failures that destroys everything people have worked to build. And as you prepare to face the second half of this medieval day, knowing that your daughter might not survive the afternoon, and your family might not survive the winter, you understand that the romantic vision of the past is not just inaccurate. It's a betrayal of the millions of people who endured these conditions with no choice, no hope of rescue, and no possibility of escape. The medieval world is not a place of noble simplicity or authentic community. It's a nightmare of systematic oppression, arbitrary violence, and grinding poverty that would defeat anyone who wasn't born into it and shaped by it from their first breath. And you've only been here for 36 hours. Your daughter's breathing has become even more laboured as the afternoon wears on, each gasp a desperate struggle that seems to require her entire tiny body. In our world, this would mean rushing to a paediatric intensive care unit where teams of specialists would work around the clock to save her life. In medieval times, it means you hold her close and wait for the inevitable, because death is coming and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. The wise woman returns just as the church bells ring for evening prayers, but this time she's not carrying her bag of useless remedies. Instead, she has the look of someone who's delivering news that everyone already knows, but no one wants to hear. "It won't be long now," she says quietly, her weathered hands gentle as she touches your daughter's burning forehead. The fever has taken hold too deeply. Make her comfortable and prepare yourselves. In our modern world, we have hospice care, pain management, and the medical knowledge to ease a child's final hours. Medieval people have nothing but helpless love and the terrible understanding that watching your children die is simply part of the human experience. You've already lost 2 babies in their first year, and now you're about to lose another child, this time old enough to have a personality, old enough to have hopes and dreams that will never be fulfilled. Your wife begins to weep with the quiet, controlled grief of someone who has learned that loud mourning is a luxury you can't afford when the living still need care. Your other children gather around their dying sister, their faces showing the premature understanding of mortality that marks every medieval childhood. They know what's happening because they've seen it before, and they know it could happen to any of them at any time. The process of dying in medieval times is not the sanitized, medicalized experience we might expect today. There are no pain medications to ease suffering, no machines to monitor vital signs, no medical interventions to prolong life or make death more comfortable. There is only the raw, biological reality of a small body shutting down while her family watches helplessly. As darkness falls over your village, your daughter takes her final breath. The moment passes without ceremony or drama. 1 second she's struggling to breathe, and the next she's simply gone, leaving behind a silence that feels heavier than any sound. In our world, this would trigger a cascade of professional interventions: death certificates, funeral directors, grief counsellors, bereavement support groups. In medieval times, It means you have until morning to dig a grave before the body begins to decay. Your family's grief must be compressed into a few hours of private mourning because survival doesn't pause for death. The hole in the ground won't dig itself, and if you don't get your daughter buried quickly, disease could spread to the rest of your family. Medieval people learn to process loss quickly and efficiently, not because they feel it less deeply, but because extended grieving is a luxury that can kill the survivors. You spend the night hours digging a small grave in the churchyard, your hands raw and bleeding from the frozen ground, your back screaming from the repetitive motion of the shovel. Other villagers have done this so many times that they can guide you to the section reserved for children, where dozens of tiny mounds mark the brief lives of medieval youth who never had a chance to grow up. The funeral, when it comes with the dawn, is a brief, practical affair conducted by a priest who has already performed 3 similar services this week. There are no elaborate eulogies or extended ceremonies, just a few Latin words that most of the villagers don't understand, and a handful of dirt thrown onto a small wooden box that you built from scrap wood during the night. Your daughter's death certificate, if such a thing existed in medieval times, would simply read fever, the same cause of death that accounts for roughly half of all medieval child mortality. There would be no investigation into why she died, no attempt to prevent similar deaths in the future, no recognition that her death was anything other than the natural order of things in a world where children are expected to die. But even as you're processing the loss of your child, medieval life is preparing to deliver its next devastating blow. As you return from the brief burial service, you find a notice posted on the village message board. A crude wooden sign where official announcements are displayed for the few villagers who can read them. The message, written in the formal language of medieval bureaucracy, informs your village that the Lord has decided to implement new taxes to fund his participation in a regional conflict that has nothing to do with your lives or interests. The amount demanded is 3 times what your village paid just 6 months ago, and it's due immediately with no exceptions or payment plans available. In our modern world, such an announcement would trigger protests, legal challenges, and political mobilization. Medieval serfs have no legal recourse, no political representation, and no way to resist except through rebellion, which is punishable by death. You can only stand there in the morning cold, reading the death sentence of your entire community, and wonder how many more of your neighbors will die from the starvation that this new tax will inevitably cause. The cruel timing of this announcement, coming on the morning you've just buried your daughter, illustrates the medieval reality that personal tragedy and systemic oppression operate on completely different schedules. The Lord's need for money doesn't pause for your grief, and your grief doesn't excuse you from his demands. Life and death, joy and sorrow, hope and despair all exist simultaneously in medieval times, compressed into an existence so brutal that most modern people couldn't psychologically survive it. As you walk back toward your hovel, wondering how your family will survive the coming winter with even fewer resources than before, you realize that you've now experienced 48 hours of medieval life. In that brief time, you've been robbed by tax collectors, terrorized by arbitrary justice, watched your child die from a preventable disease, and been informed that your family's survival prospects have just gotten dramatically worse. This is not an unusually bad medieval experience. It's simply Tuesday and Wednesday in the 14th century. The romantic vision of the past that sees these as simpler, more authentic times has been revealed as not just wrong, but almost insultingly naive. Medieval life was a grinding, relentless struggle against conditions so harsh that survival itself was an achievement worthy of celebration. But perhaps the most sobering realization is that this medieval nightmare was reality for billions of people for hundreds of years. Generation after generation lived and died under these conditions, with no realistic hope that things would ever get better. no understanding that human existence could be any different, and no choice but to endure whatever fate and feudalism imposed upon them. As you reach your hovel and prepare to face whatever fresh horrors the medieval world has in store for you, you understand that the question isn't whether modern people could survive in medieval times, it's how anyone ever survived at all. The fact that humanity endured these conditions and eventually built something better is perhaps the most remarkable achievement in human history. And that's why you wouldn't last a day growing up in medieval times, not because you're weak or spoiled, but because you've been fortunate enough to live in an era when human dignity, individual rights, and basic survival are considered birthright rather than impossible dreams. The medieval world was a place where those dreams didn't exist, couldn't exist, and wouldn't exist for centuries to come. Your second night in medieval times is beginning, and already you know that every hour you survive is borrowed time in a world that was never designed for human happiness, comfort, or hope.